Saddam Hussein, the infamous dictator who ruled Iraq with an iron fist for over 2 decades, and the soldiers who captured him, two forces hurtling toward an inevitable collision, set the stage for a gripping final 24 hours that would change Iraq's future forever. As the world held its breath, Saddam's fate seemed sealed. But within those last hours of his life, secrets would be revealed, choices made, and a nation's painful reckoning with its past would finally begin. Saddam Hussein, once the towering figure of Iraq, had a life marked by ambition, power, and brutality. His rise to power began in the 1960s when he became involved in the Ba'ath Party, an organization dedicated to Arab nationalism and socialism. By 1979, Saddam had consolidated his control over Iraq, becoming its president. His rule was characterized by intense oppression, the elimination of political enemies, and the cultivation of a cult of personality. His brutal tactics, including widespread torture, mass executions, and the use of chemical weapons against his own people, created a legacy of fear and division. For decades, Saddam enjoyed near absolute control over Iraq. His power extended from the government to the military, where he built a formidable army. He managed to keep a tight grip on the nation, using a mix of fear, manipulation, and strategic alliances. However, despite his strength, Saddam was not invulnerable. The international community began to take notice of his aggressive foreign policies and human rights abuses. His invasion of Iran in 1980 resulted in an 8-year-long conflict that left hundreds of thousands dead. Despite the war's staggering costs, Saddam remained in power, and the world seemed to tolerate his regime, partly due to the geopolitical importance of Iraq. In 1990, Saddam's most controversial act would come to define his legacy: the invasion of Kuwait. He justified the invasion by claiming that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq and that it had been illegally drilling oil from Iraqi fields. The international community, led by the United States, condemned this act. The United Nations imposed sanctions, and the United States, along with a coalition of nations, launched Operation Desert Storm, which quickly expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The war left Saddam weakened but still in power, though his regime was tarnished on the world stage. Despite the crushing sanctions and constant threat of military intervention, Saddam clung to power. He ruthlessly suppressed any uprisings or resistance within Iraq, particularly during the 1990s, when several rebellions were quashed in bloodbaths. He also continued to defy UN resolutions, demanding the destruction of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. This defiance set the stage for the next chapter of his downfall. By the early 2000s, Iraq's relationship with the United States had deteriorated dramatically. The events of September 11, 2001, and the subsequent War on Terror reshaped the geopolitical landscape. The Bush administration, driven by the belief that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to terrorist groups, began to focus on removing him from power. The build-up to war was swift. In March 2003, the United States and its allies invaded Iraq in a move that was both controversial and inevitable. The invasion was quick and overwhelming. Within weeks, the coalition forces had captured Baghdad, and Saddam's regime was effectively toppled. However, Saddam himself managed to escape, disappearing into the vast Iraqi countryside. For months, the world's most wanted man was elusive, slipping through the fingers of the American military. Rumors circulated that he was hiding in his home city of Tikrit, protected by loyal supporters and insurgents. But each lead seemed to come to nothing. By late 2003, the global manhunt had reached a fever pitch, and Saddam's days as a fugitive were rapidly coming to an end. The search for Saddam Hussein intensified in the weeks following the fall of Baghdad. The United States military, along with Iraqi forces loyal to the new government, scoured the country for any sign of the former dictator. The Iraqi countryside, particularly the region around his hometown of Tikrit, was teeming with insurgents and loyalists who were determined to protect him. Despite the chaos, Saddam remained a symbol of defiance for many, and his capture became not just a military objective, but a matter of national pride. At first, Saddam's whereabouts remained a mystery. Intelligence sources suggested he had been hiding in remote areas, relying on a network of loyalists to help him evade detection. This network, which included former members of his regime's security forces and local militias, made it incredibly difficult for the U.S. military to locate him. For months, soldiers combed through villages, interrogated suspects, and followed leads that always seemed to end in dead ends. Despite their best efforts, Saddam's capture seemed impossible, and the hunt stretched on for much longer than anyone had anticipated. Then, in December 2003, a breakthrough came. A tip from an informant led to a specific location: a farmhouse near the town of Ad-Dor, close to Tikrit. The U.S. military acted quickly, assembling a team of soldiers for a raid on the location. The operation was covert and meticulously planned. The soldiers knew that this could be their best chance to finally capture the most wanted man in the world. They moved swiftly, approaching the farmhouse under the cover of darkness. As the team approached, the house appeared deserted. It was an old, weathered structure surrounded by farmland, a place that seemed unlikely to harbor a fugitive of Saddam's stature. But the soldiers had learned never to underestimate the cunning of their prey. They moved in, securing the area before entering the building. After a brief search, they discovered an underground hideout, an escape tunnel of sorts, cleverly hidden beneath the floorboards. It was in this makeshift bunker, buried in the earth beneath the farmhouse, that they found Saddam Hussein. Former leader of Iraq was hiding in what could only be described as a small hole in the ground. His appearance was a far cry from the powerful figure who had once commanded an entire nation. He was unshaven, dirty, and disheveled, wearing a simple jacket and trousers. He looked older than his 66 years, a man broken by the relentless pressure of being a fugitive. But even in his disheveled state, he carried himself with a certain air of defiance. When the soldiers discovered him, Saddam made no immediate attempt to resist. He simply sat there, looking at them with a mix of resignation and defiance. In the initial moments of his capture, Saddam did not acknowledge his identity. The soldiers, still unsure, questioned him, asking if he was indeed the former president of Iraq. He denied it, stating that he was just a simple farmer. It was a strange response given the circumstances, but Saddam's years of leadership and manipulation had taught him how to play mind games, even in the most vulnerable of situations. His refusal to cooperate, however, only prolonged the process of confirming his identity. It wasn't until a few minutes later, when one of the soldiers saw a tattoo on his hand, that the truth became undeniable. The tattoo was the name of Saddam's family, a detail only those close to him would know. With this final clue, it was clear. The man they had found was indeed Saddam Hussein. The capture was a monumental moment, not just for the U.S. military, but for the entire world. The man who had once ruled with absolute power was now in custody, and Iraq, and the Middle East as a whole, stood on the brink of a new chapter. However, this would be just the beginning of a long and complicated process, one that would raise questions of justice, retribution, and the future of a fractured nation. In the immediate aftermath of Saddam Hussein's capture, the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. The U.S. military had just seized the man who had once ruled Iraq with an iron fist, and there was a sense of both victory and trepidation. The news of his arrest quickly spread across the globe, sparking reactions from governments, military analysts, and citizens alike. However, for those in charge of his custody, the focus immediately shifted to what would happen next. How would Saddam be treated, interrogated, and what information could he provide? After Saddam was taken from the small farmhouse in Ad-Dar, he was flown to a U.S. military base. The base, located in the heart of Iraq, was heavily guarded, and the first priority was ensuring that the former president was securely detained. He was stripped of his personal effects and placed under tight surveillance, isolated from the outside world. At this point, the authorities knew that Saddam would be a significant asset for intelligence gathering. His connections, his knowledge of the inner workings of the Ba'ath Party, and any secrets regarding weapons of mass destruction were invaluable. When Saddam arrived at the military base, he was subjected to initial interrogations. However, his response was hardly cooperative. In the first hours, he repeatedly denied being Saddam Hussein, the former president of Iraq. He claimed he was just a simple farmer, a man with no significant ties to the former government or the country's troubled past. This refusal to acknowledge his identity was a tactic that Saddam had employed before, one designed to confuse and delay. The U.S. officials, however, were not deterred. They had already seen his face on countless wanted posters, and they knew exactly who he was. For several hours, Saddam's identity was the subject of confusion, but eventually, a U.S. intelligence officer recognized a distinct feature that sealed the confirmation: a tattoo of the name of his family, a detail known only to close associates. As soon as it became clear that the man in custody was indeed Saddam Hussein, the interrogation began in earnest. But Saddam, even in his weakened state, remained calm and composed. He refused to provide any useful information, even when the interrogators pressed him on Iraq's weapons programs, links to terrorist groups, and the existence of hidden caches of weapons of mass destruction. The military used a combination of psychological tactics to try and break his resistance. They sought to disorient him by isolating him, keeping him in uncomfortable conditions, and denying him contact with the outside world. Despite the pressure, Saddam remained obstinate. His behavior suggested that he did not view himself as a prisoner, but rather as someone temporarily displaced, with the belief that his eventual return to power was still possible. It was a strange contrast to the man who had once commanded the loyalty of millions, but even in captivity, Saddam's arrogance was apparent. He seemed to hold on to the hope that his loyalists would somehow come to his aid, and that his reign was not truly over. The longer he remained in custody, the more psychological games were played. U.S. officials knew they needed to understand Saddam's inner circle, his resources, and most importantly, the operational structure of his regime. They hoped that through extended interrogation they could extract critical information. Saddam was questioned over and over, his mind picked apart in search of answers. Yet, in the hours and days following his capture, it became evident that Saddam's pride was as much of a barrier as his silence. He refused to be broken, displaying a stubborn defiance that made him a challenging prisoner to handle. Saddam's first hours in captivity were marked by an eerie calmness, but there was also a shift within him. For the first time in many years, he was no longer the powerful leader, but a man with no control over his future. This realization began to set in during his initial interrogations. Despite his refusal to cooperate, it was clear that Saddam was beginning to process the full weight of his downfall. His power had crumbled, and the world had shifted from fearing him to holding him accountable. What remained unclear, however, was how far his defiance would take him and whether the finality of his fate was something he had come to accept, or if he still clung to hope for a return to power. As news of Saddam Hussein's capture spread like wildfire across the globe, the implications of his arrest rippled far beyond the military base where he was being held. The world was fixated on the image of the former Iraqi president, a man who had once ruled with unmatched authority, now in U.S. custody. His capture marked the official end of Saddam Hussein's reign, but also signaled the beginning of a new and uncertain phase for Iraq and the Middle East. While the political landscape began to shift, Saddam's fate was the subject of intense global scrutiny. For many in the United States, Saddam's capture was seen as a victory in the broader context of the war on terror. His removal from power had been one of the central justifications for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The Bush administration had argued that Saddam's regime posed a threat due to its alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction and its ties to terrorist organizations. Although no weapons of mass destruction were found after the invasion, the capture of Saddam Hussein was widely hailed as a success, both as a symbolic blow to the Ba'athist regime and a tangible achievement in the fight against terrorism. For American officials, Saddam's capture was a moment of triumph, a way to demonstrate that the U.S. military could topple even the most entrenched and dangerous dictatorships. However, Saddam's arrest also provoked a different reaction in Iraq and the wider Middle East. For Iraqis who had suffered under Saddam's brutal rule for decades, his capture was both a moment of justice and a reminder of the painful years of oppression. Some rejoiced at the prospect of seeing him held accountable for his crimes, while others feared that his removal would unleash new chaos and instability in a country already torn apart by war. Saddam's supporters, many of whom still clung to the idea of his return to power, viewed his capture as a profound betrayal. To them, he was a martyr and a symbol of national pride, and they continued to resist the US-led occupation and the new government that was being formed in Baghdad. Internationally, Saddam's capture also raised uncomfortable questions. His removal from power had left a power vacuum in Iraq, one that was quickly filled by various factions, including sectarian militias, insurgent groups, and competing political forces. The US military, which had initially seen the invasion as a mission to bring democracy to Iraq, now found itself struggling to manage the fallout from Saddam's removal. The rise of insurgency and sectarian violence quickly spiraled out of control, leading to a prolonged and bloody conflict that would devastate the country for years to come. As the days passed following Saddam's capture, the political ramifications continued to unfold. While some saw the arrest as the final chapter in Iraq's oppressive past, others feared that it marked the beginning of a much more dangerous phase in the country's history. The chaos that had erupted after Saddam's fall only deepened the divide between Iraq's Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations, leaving the country in a fragile and volatile state. At the same time, the US military and Iraqi authorities prepared for what would come next: Saddam's trial. The prospect of a formal trial, where he would face charges for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, raised the stakes even higher. For many, this trial was seen as an opportunity for justice, a chance to hold Saddam accountable for the atrocities committed under his rule. But for others, it was a reminder that Iraq's path to stability would be fraught with challenges. The country's wounds were still raw, and the specter of Saddam's legacy loomed large. As the world watched, the question remained: what would Saddam Hussein's ultimate fate be? Would he be tried and convicted, or would his supporters somehow free him, returning him to power? The answers to these questions seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear: Saddam's capture was a pivotal moment, marking not only the fall of one of the most feared dictators of the 20th century, but also the beginning of an uncertain future for Iraq and the Middle East. As the days passed after Saddam Hussein's capture, the situation grew increasingly tense. His physical confinement in a US military base marked the end of his political reign, but it was far from the end of his influence. Despite being removed from power and cut off from his loyal supporters, Saddam Hussein still represented a rallying point for many Iraqis. His loyalists, primarily from the Sunni minority, were not easily subdued. They were determined to preserve his legacy and fight against the American occupation, believing that his removal would fracture Iraq's stability irreparably. Insurgent groups and former regime members began to mobilize, launching attacks across Iraq in an attempt to destabilize the newly formed government. In those first few days after his capture, Saddam himself seemed relatively calm, even resigned to his fate. However, his inner circle was still active in the shadows, making plans to secure his release. The expectation of a rescue operation began to rise among his followers, who believed that if they acted quickly, they could overpower the American forces holding him. Several attempts to free Saddam were rumored to have been made, some involving armed insurgents or tribal networks sympathetic to his cause. These reports heightened the sense of urgency for the military, which ramped up security measures to ensure that Saddam was not freed by force. Despite his defiance and refusal to cooperate during the interrogations, there was something different in the air as the hours turned into days. Saddam began to exhibit signs of fear. It was subtle at first, but noticeable. The man who had once confidently commanded armies and ruled a nation with absolute authority now found himself at the mercy of his captors. He was no longer surrounded by the loyalists who had once defended him, and the specter of his eventual trial began to take shape in his mind. Saddam knew what awaited him. The accusations against him were severe, ranging from the mass killings of his political enemies to the brutal suppression of uprisings and the use of chemical weapons on his own people. The prospect of facing justice weighed heavily on him, even if he refused to fully acknowledge the scale of his own crimes. The longer he stayed in captivity, the more Saddam seemed to withdraw into himself, reflecting on the past. The very power that had once made him feel invincible was now absent. His control over Iraq had evaporated, and his future was uncertain. There were moments when he seemed almost introspective, his defiance giving way to the bitter reality of his downfall. But even in those quiet moments, he never completely lost the arrogance that had defined him for decades. He still believed deep down that he was destined to return to power, that the forces working against him could not last forever. Perhaps it was this delusion that allowed him to maintain a sense of composure in the face of his inevitable execution. Meanwhile, the world continued to watch. The American military forces held Saddam securely, but there was an undercurrent of fear that his supporters might escalate their efforts to free him. The U.S. military, aware of these potential risks, made the decision to move Saddam to a more secure location. Despite their efforts, some insiders were convinced that Saddam's loyalists would attempt a high-stakes rescue mission, relying on his widespread network of allies in Iraq and the region. In the midst of the growing tension, another unexpected twist occurred. Saddam's mental state began to deteriorate as the reality of his situation sank in. The days of being a powerful, feared dictator had been replaced by the grim reality of captivity. Some reports even suggested that he began to entertain the idea that he might not survive this. The man who once believed that his rule was unshakable was now realizing that he would never walk free again. Yet, despite the psychological toll of his situation, he continued to hold on to his pride, refusing to offer up the information that interrogators were desperate to obtain. The hopes of a dramatic rescue were dashed as the military tightened its grip on Saddam's security. But for the former president, the real battle had already begun. A battle with his own mind, his own sense of self-worth, and the inevitable fate that awaited him. As the world awaited his trial, Saddam's final days in captivity marked the last, uncertain chapter of his life. Whether he would die in a courtroom, executed for his crimes, or fall at the hands of his own people remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. Saddam Hussein's story was far from over, and the consequences of his actions would reverberate across Iraq for years to come. As Saddam Hussein's final days approached, the world anxiously watched, waiting for the inevitable conclusion to the life of one of the most infamous dictators in modern history. His capture had signaled the collapse of his regime, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase for Iraq, one filled with uncertainty and unrest. His loyalists, even in the face of his capture, continued to resist the U.S. occupation, and the country was in turmoil. Saddam, once a symbol of strength and authority, now faced the harsh reality of his demise. In the months following his arrest, Saddam was subjected to constant surveillance and interrogation. His captors sought to extract valuable intelligence from him about hidden weapons caches, insurgent networks, and any potential allies still operating in the shadows. But Saddam refused to cooperate. His silence became a form of resistance, and it was clear that while his power had been stripped away, his defiance remained. He never acknowledged the gravity of his crimes or expressed any remorse. To the end, he believed he was above the justice that others sought to impose on him. As the time for Saddam's trial approached, his fate became a matter of international debate. Some called for a swift and public trial, believing that the former dictator's crimes against humanity and the people of Iraq should be aired for all to see. Others argued that he should face execution immediately, to bring closure to the long-suffering nation he had ruled with cruelty. The government of Iraq, now in the hands of the U.S.-backed administration, struggled to manage the process of trying the former leader. The country was still reeling from the effects of war, and many wondered whether a trial would be an effective means of healing or merely another chapter in the country's violent history. Eventually, Saddam's trial began in October 2005, and it was broadcast to the world. The proceedings were highly charged, with strong emotions on all sides. The Iraqi people, many of whom had suffered under his regime, wanted justice. Survivors of the brutal suppression of uprisings, the victims of the chemical weapons attacks, and families of those who had been executed during his reign packed the courtroom. They wanted to see the man who had brought so much pain and suffering finally held accountable. Saddam, despite being in captivity, remained defiant throughout the trial. He denied the charges, often interrupting the proceedings with his outbursts. His arrogance was apparent, even in the face of the overwhelming evidence against him. For him, the trial was not about seeking mercy or redemption. It was a platform to maintain his image as a leader, to assert that he had been right in his actions, that he had been defending Iraq against foreign invaders and traitors. He showed no remorse, no humility, and in many ways the trial became a final reflection of the man he had been, unrepentant and prideful to the bitter end. The trial was often chaotic, with delays and disruptions, including Saddam's outbursts and the complex political climate in Iraq. Ultimately, Saddam Hussein was found guilty of crimes against humanity, specifically for his role in the 1982 Dujail massacre, in which 148 Shiite villagers were executed after an assassination attempt on him. On November 5, 2006, he was sentenced to death by hanging. It was a verdict that many Iraqis had been waiting for, though it also sparked division. Some saw it as justice, while others viewed it as a politically motivated execution, a symbol of the deep divisions within the country. On December 30, 2006, Saddam Hussein was executed. The execution was carried out in the early hours of the Isma morning, and it was a moment that many had anticipated for years. His death was a symbolic end to his reign of terror, but for Iraq, it did not immediately bring peace. The country was still embroiled in violence, sectarian conflict, and insurgency. The removal of Saddam Hussein from the political stage had not solved the deep-rooted issues that plagued Iraq. His execution was a moment of closure for many, but it was also a reminder that the wounds he left on the nation were far from healed. Saddam Hussein's final 24 hours were marked by a somber inevitability. The man who had once ruled Iraq with an iron fist instilled fear in millions and manipulated his way to power, was now just a prisoner facing the consequences of his actions. His legacy would live on in the history books, not as the man who united Iraq, but as the man who left a country torn apart by his own ambitions. The execution did not end the turmoil in Iraq, but it did close the chapter on a dark period in the nation's history. Saddam Hussein, the man who had once seemed untouchable, was now gone, and Iraq, though still struggling, began the difficult path toward rebuilding and healing.